Welcome, everybody, to this month's edition of our webinar series. This one's Shadow AI in the Workplace. We will get started in just a few moments. Appreciate everybody's punctuality. In the meantime, we are going to put a little poll up. We just kind of want to know what you're currently using in your environments and that you know of. And so we will start out with a bit of a polling question, just to get you used to the way the polls work. Make sure you're not only here, you're awake and started. The I don't know, the IDK is always the more concerning one. And that's, as we have this webinar today on Shadow AI, that's part of what we'll be discussing. Hope everybody's having a great start to their week and we're past the halfway point in the month. This year seems to have been flying by for me. I can't believe it's already the middle of August. So a couple bits of housekeeping. One thing I always like to point out is if you have questions throughout the webinar, I always encourage you, don't try to remember them. Don't wait until the end. You'll see at the top of the screen, there's a Q&A panel, and you just click on that Q&A, ask your questions there. That way we can get to them when we get to the Q&A portion. We try to pay attention to that and maybe even answer them as we go, but that doesn't always happen. This way, none of us forget about your questions. We can make sure we are responding to you. All right, now that we are a minute in, check our chat. I do see we have a polling question in the chat. Perfect. Hopefully everybody can hear us okay, see everything okay. If you have any issues, please let us know and we'll get that addressed for you. So we're going to go ahead and get started for the sake of time. And so just so everybody knows, I'm Heath Madison here at TrustedTech. I'm our Senior Director of Professional Services. So I have myself over 30 years in the technology industry, so it's fun to watch all these different cycles. And AI is such a big transformation. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today, but I'm joined by some people who are also going to provide very keen insights to us. And I'm going to start out with Edwin.
Thanks, Heath. Good morning, team. My name is Edwin Manlapas. Pleased to be meeting with you all today. I am a frontline leader for our M365 and Azure new business teams today. So really looking forward to getting into things. Scarlett?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Scarlett King, Associate Director at Cavendish Consulting, which is TrustedTech's UK public relations agency here in London. And yeah, we led on the creation of the research and yeah, really looking forward to running you through the Shadow AI research. And over to Daniel.
Thank you, Scarlett. Yeah, hello everyone, and good morning or good afternoon. My name is Daniel Levis. I'm an Associate Cloud Architect at TrustedTech, and I've been with the company for over 2 years. I look forward to speaking with you all about best practices for shielding against Shadow AI usage. And I'll go ahead and hand it over to Heath to go over the agenda for today.
So what are we talking about today? Obviously, we can all see the title. We've all read the synopsis on the registration invite. But here's where we're going to focus our time today in this order. We're going to start out with the reality of Shadow AI, not just what we're going to tell you, but what over 2,000 people have told us. Then we're going to shift to the leadership paradox, why senior employees are the biggest risk. Hopefully that means present company excluded everybody. Then we're going to shift over to the AI skills divide and the ban paradox, followed by the Microsoft 365 price change and what it means for the governance of this. And then we're going to talk about how you can actually build a more governed path to AI adoption. So hopefully that's what you're expecting today, because that's what we're going to be talking about. So as we talk, before we get to the first section, I wanted to make sure everybody here knows you get to be part of our survey. We talked, that we're going to be talking about today with Cavendish and the research they did. So with all our attendees here, now we're going to be even 2,000 plus respondents on some of these questions. And so we're going to start out with the Shadow AI reality, what 2,000 employees told us, with a polling question. How concerned are you about Shadow AI in your org? And so while you go ahead and get your answers in place for that one, we will go ahead and move on and we'll get started. So we'll start out with Scarlett.
Great, thanks, Heath. Yeah, so as I mentioned briefly, we Cavendish led on the creation of this research. So I just wanted to start with sort of a nod to why we did it all, because I think really that shapes sort of what you're about to see. Now, in our planning phase, what we found is that every piece of research on AI risk out there at the moment all has the same structure. You know, you ask CIOs, you ask CISOs, you ask heads of departments what they think is happening inside of their organization. And you get a very coherent picture back, which is, you know, we have an AI policy, we are using AI tools, and yes, we have some leakage at the edges. But we wanted to test that, not by asking leadership again, but by asking the people who are actually doing the work. And we tested 2,000 of them, in fact. And what came back was quite interesting because surprisingly, it doesn't match what the picture of the leadership has itself. And I think that's sort of what makes this report so interesting. And we'll come on to look at some of those findings in a second. But just moving on to sort of how we did it, we partnered with a third-party research provider named SensusWide to conduct some sort of public market research. And we surveyed about 2,000 employees across the US and the UK back in March earlier this year. And there were kind of three design principles really that underpinned the Shadow AI campaign. The first design decision was who we asked. So we purposefully chose to survey employees rather than just IT. And I suppose that kind of sounds obvious, you know, when you say it out loud, but actually almost nobody does it. And the reason is because IT leaders are the ones buying everyone's software or the products that you're selling. But the problem you get if you do that is you end up measuring what leadership actually believes about their own organization, which of course is a real thing to measure. It just isn't the same thing as what's necessarily actually happening in their organization. And I think that gap between the belief of leadership and the behavior of the actual employees doing the work and using the AI tools actually turned out to be the entire story of our Shadow AI campaign for TrustedTech. Now, the second design decision is kind of simple. It's what we asked. So we asked specifically about behaviors rather than attitudes. Again, there's a lot of survey work in this space at the moment that's asking, you know, are you concerned about AI risk, or do you think governance is important? And you get pretty much a majority agreement. You know, 90% of people will say, yes, it's a risk. And honestly, that doesn't really tell you a lot, right? Everyone knows the right answer to that question. So instead of that, we didn't ask what people think. We asked sort of what tools they use, whether those tools are approved by their employer, and critically, whether they know the difference and the risks associated with doing so. And I think that sort of last one around the risks is probably the most important piece here, which we'll come back on to. And the third and final design principle is where we asked employees. So as I said earlier, we surveyed both markets across the US and the UK. Now, partly that's because that's where our audience lies for TrustedTech, but also it was kind of a test. You know, if you see the same behavior in two countries with two very different cultures and very different regulation when it comes to AI, and you get the same problem coming back to you, then really we're looking at something a lot bigger, something structural and a wider issue around how people are using AI. And I mean, I'll be honest in terms of what I expected to find. You know, I expected Shadow AI to be a junior problem, you know, someone a year or 2 years into their career pasting client documentation into ChatGPT because it's faster and nobody's watching. And I think that's the kind of mental model that I had going in, and probably the assumption that most of us on this call maybe would have, and what our governance models are built around. But that is not what the data shows at all, not even close. And I know that Edwin is sort of going to take you through shortly exactly who are the culprits using Shadow AI. But just on the next slide, I just want to set this up with two numbers that kind of set up exactly everything you're going to hear today. And the first on the left here is that, you know, 48% of employees globally are using unapproved AI tools at work. And by that, we mean unsanctioned AI tools that have not been approved for use by the organization and your employer. And I think what's important about this stat specifically is, it's not a fringe behavior or an early adopter mindset thing. At 48%, you're describing half of the workforce across the UK and the US. And then on the second number here on the right is one that I found particularly interesting. And that's of those people using shadow AI, 77% already understand the risks of doing so. And that's not 77% of employees globally, that's 77% of those using the unsanctioned AI tools. So they know the tool isn't approved. They know there's a question about where the data goes and the reputational risk that an organization can face, yet they're still using it. And we'll come on to why that might be. And I think really that single fact, that 77% really changes what you as businesses can sort of usefully do about this. Because, if people didn't know the risks and it were an information problem, you can train, you can remind, you can add a module to onboarding, you send that all staff email, but they do know. So the awareness intervention isn't anything to be fixed. There isn't a gap in what people understand. It's a gap in what happens when they act on it. It's an enforcement problem, really. And I suppose underneath that, there's something harder as well. When someone knowingly accepts a compliance risk to use a particular tool, that's telling you something about the sanctioned alternative. So, what approved AI tools is your organization proposing that people aren't using because they don't like it? They obviously don't think it's, good enough to be worth it. And that's not a discipline problem. That's a product problem. So the question therefore stops being how do we make people aware, and it becomes who is doing this and why do we think it's worth the risk? And I will hand over to Edwin to sort of chat through the first half of that now.
Amazing. Thank you, Scarlett. What I find particularly important about the 77% statistic is what it tells us about the nature of the problem. And this is what Scarlett was describing just a moment ago. This isn't primarily an awareness issue anymore. Employees, as the data mentions, generally understand that there are risks associated with using unapproved or unsanctioned AI tools. However, many of them are choosing to use those tools anyway. That changes the conversation for security and for compliance teams. If people already know the policy, another annual training course probably isn't going to solve the problem. The issue becomes visibility, yes, and also enforcement. Can the organization actually see which tools are being used, understand what data is going into them, and provide employees with an approved option that meets the needs they're trying to solve? So when we say policy blind, we don't necessarily mean employees are blind to the policy. We mean the activity itself can be blind to the organization. The risk is still there, certainly. You just might not be able to see it. And that visibility problem gets even more interesting when we look at who is most likely to be using these tools, which we'll get to in a moment. Back to you, Heath.
So in this section, we're going to be talking about the leadership paradox and why senior employees are the biggest risk. And it is interesting because I was looking at the last polling question that we had, and it kind of does align with a lot of the stuff you've been saying, Scarlett and Edwin. In fact, over 98% of you at least have a concern. If you didn't come into the webinar, you do now. Only one person had no concern. And so I told you we were going to all let you be part of our respondents. So now I saw Scarlett's 2001 respondents is now up to 2054. And so we are going to ask another polling question as we start this next session. I promise, by the way, before you see the question, we're not sharing this with anybody. You were not telling your managers, but have you used an AI tool at work when your organization isn't formally approved? Regularly, occasionally, no, never? I'm not sure what counts as approved. All these are valid answers. I promise we're not telling anybody. I'm even answering it honestly myself. Edwin, don't tell IT my answer, please.
Secret's safe with me.
So as we go to this next session, we start talking about how the leadership can be the biggest concerns. I'm going to hand it back to Edwin.
Thanks, Heath. So this was probably one of the most surprising findings in the research. The conventional image of shadow IT, which we can all probably guess is a junior employee downloading something they shouldn't or experimenting without telling IT. Our data turns that assumption almost entirely upside down. 65% of senior decision makers told us they use unapproved AI tooling, compared with just 31% of the people they on their teams. So the highest risk population isn't necessarily sitting at the edge of these organizations. In many cases, it's the people with the greatest access to information, the most organizational influence, and potentially the most sensitive data. And that matters because these are often the same leaders involved in approving or enforcing the organization's AI policies. And on the next slide, when we look at the C-suite specifically, the contradiction becomes even more clear. So among C-level executives, that number rises even further. 73% admit to using unapproved AI tools. What makes this particularly interesting is that this isn't necessarily happening because leaders are unconcerned about the problem. 56% of decision makers say they're worried about shadow AI inside their own organizations, while still using unapproved tools themselves. Now, that contradiction I want to zero in on for a moment because it's really important. A leader can fully appreciate the organizational risk and still decide that the productivity benefit or competitive pressure is worth making an exception for themselves. And because senior leaders often work with strategy, with financial information, customer data, contracts, and other sensitive materials, the consequences of that exception can be much, much greater. So the governance question is not simply, do our employees understand the policy? It is also, does the approved experience actually work well enough that our leaders are willing to follow it? So why would a senior leader who understands the risk still go around the approved tools? The research points to three distinct factors. The first here is visibility. Approved enterprise tools can be monitored. Now, for some users, an unapproved tool can feel faster, it can feel easier, or simply less visible. The second is surveillance. Senior leaders may simply, or maybe especially sensitive to the idea that their prompts, their usage patterns, their experiments could be tied back to them and their corporate identity. The third is career risk, which I think is particularly important. AI has moved enormously quickly, so quickly that leaders increasingly feel pressure to demonstrate that they understand it, that they are using it. And for some people, being perceived as behind on AI may feel like a bigger professional risk than violating an internal technology policy. So when we put all of those three things together, you can see why simply telling people don't use unapproved AI is no longer enough. Organizations have to make the governed path practical enough that people actually choose it. So before we press on here, the biggest takeaway from this section is that shadow AI isn't primarily a bottom-up problem. In many, if not most organizations, the risk is actually concentrated at the very top of the org chart. I'll pass things back to you.
Thanks. We all see that all the time. I'm sitting here following the chat along as well, and the challenges that we encounter. And what I can say is none of those challenges, you're not alone in any of them. But really, it's getting the leaders in the organization to model the desired behavior. And that's how we make it kind of a top-down approach. I know convincing the leaders about the shiny new tool they saw or someone else just showed them can be a challenge. So we just, it's information about the risks, because they also have a responsibility to the organization on that risk. So there's ways that we can influence them by talking about what we recommend as technology experts and what we find is the safest to the organization, and arm that with real evidence. Here's why. I don't want to spoiler alert some, but we, for instance, do an AI readiness assessment, and that's really what it's about. Here's your risk, and here's what happens if you don't. And there are ways that we can actually help communicate and educate on that decision as well. And you can do the same thing. And one of the other things I saw coming up here is training users and the skills divide, and how do you handle that? We all have limited bandwidth in our days. So as we get to this, where we talk about the AI skills divide, I want to ask this question. I already know what one person's answer is going to be based on the chat. Does your organization offer employees formal AI training? And how is that? Is that regular? Yeah, we've done some training. No, but we want to. That could very well be the answer of the person I saw in the chat that said we'd love to, but there's just no time. And where do you find that right balancing act? Regularly, that's great. When I see some response coming back as that's great to hear. Because once again, one of the things I posted in the chat was nature abhors a vacuum. And if we don't give them away, they will find their own. And it's important that we have the kind of those guidelines in place. So to start talking about this, I'm going to hand this off to our very own Daniel Olivas.
Thank you, Heath. Yes. So I know looking back at a previous polling questions, we did ask about the concerns with AI usage within the organization, and the majority did kind of show that there are some concerns. Now, one of the things we don't want to do with that concern is implement a whole org-wide ban on AI usage. And on this slide, it shows how many people said they would keep using AI tools even if their organization banned them. Employees overall are already high at 29%, but decision makers are even higher at 37%. And that matters because decision makers are often the people working with sensitive information. Items such as customer details, contracts, strategy, financials, internal planning. And so the risk is not just that someone ignores policy, it is that the workaround may involve the highest risk data. It's similar to prohibition. When the alcohol ban did not remove demand, it pushed people to find ways around the law. And we saw the same kind of workplace version later with shadow IT, when employees used tools like Dropbox or Google Drive because approved file sharing felt too slow or unavailable. And so the issue was not that people stopped needing to share information, they moved that work into places IT could not easily secure, monitor, or support. And so shadow AI follows the same pattern. The business need does not disappear just because the tool is banned. If users still need to summarize, draft, analyze, and or move faster, they may find another path through personal accounts or unmanaged tools. And so bans do not always stop usage, they just move it somewhere harder to see and control. And on the next slide, let's look at what happens when that usage moves underground. And so in this slide, it shows that what can happen when an organization relies only on a blanket ban. The ban is announced, but the work does not go away. People still need to draft content, summarize information, analyze data, and move quickly. If there is no approved option, users can only move underground through personal accounts, personal devices, or tools the organization cannot monitor. And that is where visibility drops. Security teams lose insight into what tools are being used, what data is being copied, and where that information is going. And so the exposure can grow because no one can see it anymore. And so the goal is not to pretend that every AI risk disappears. The goal is to keep AI work inside an improved environment where the company still has visibility, policy enforcement, and user guidance. Once usage is visible, leadership can see where training is needed and which use cases should be encouraged or restricted. And so a ban does not remove the risk, it entirely just removes your ability to see it, and that is when exposure grows within your environment. And the next slide, we'll look at the skills divide and why training becomes the better path moving forward, as opposed to a blanket ban. And so in this slide, there's this data point here where essentially there is a 35-point gap between how confident leaders feel about their AI skills and how confident employees feel. And at the same time, most employees are still self-taught, either through YouTube videos or through how-to guides. And so what that tells us essentially is that there's the issue is not interest, is that people want to use AI, and many already are. And so the divide isn't really about who wants to use AI. It is about who has been given a clear path to learn it, understand the boundaries, and apply it safely in their actual work. If most employees are self-taught, everything can end up with different standards for what good AI usage looks like. Training helps close that gap by giving people practical scenarios, role-based guidance, and a common language for responsible use. And the divide is not about willingness, it is about giving people the right enablement and direction. And in the next slide, we'll look at what effect training adoption looks like in practice. And so this whole slide here, this is where training adoption has become important. If people are already interested in AI, the goal is not just tell them to stop or hand them a license and assume adoption will happen on their own. The goal is to give users a clear place to start and a consistent way to build skills. And that does not mean that every organization can only use one AI tool, but adoption is easier when enablement starts around one primary system. So for many Microsoft 365 customers, that primary system is Copilot because it's already inside the tools used every day. Now, looking back at another polling question from earlier today for today's webinar, going into kind of the stats of what you guys have chosen for what AI assistants you guys deploy in your organization here, we're kind of split between Copilot, Claude, and ChatGPT. So for your organizations, for instance, you might want to have training be oriented to those other platforms like Claude, like ChatGPT, for instance. And so that all matters because users generally do not think AI in abstract terms. They know whether it can help them summarize. They want to know whether it can help them summarize a meeting, draft the message, compare documents, or prepare customers for a conversation. And so training has to meet them at that level, practical, role-based, or tied to work they already understand. And that is why the items on this slide work together. Role-based enablement shows people where AI fits in their job. Hands-on training builds confidence. Adoption support keeps momentum going. And responsive AI practice makes sure that people understand the boundaries. And so the point is not just to buy Copilot or pick any AI tool. The stronger point is that adoption needs a structure. If users are only left to figure it out on their own, they will keep learning through trial and error or going back to outside tools. Training gives them a better path inside the approved environment. And so AI adoption works best when people have a clear, approved place to learn and a practical reason to use it. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Heath to move us to the next session.
Wonderful, great information. We've seen that a lot, and I just wanted to kind of to respond to a couple of the comments I see. You know, it's a struggle to get users to use AI. I agree. A lot of that's because it's lack of awareness, lack of understanding. I'll be honest, myself, I was a late adopter of AI. I'll leave it at that. I grew up in the time of Terminator, and I'm worried Cybernet's on its way. And Skynet from Cyberdyne, sorry, is on its way. But the more and more I use it, what I find is the more and more use cases I find for it. So it's getting users some of those simple kind of use cases that show them how it improves their day-to-day. It's not to replace their job. It's not to replace their role. It is to make it more efficient. One of the things I like to say is users also have a hesitancy towards AI because they're worried it's coming to take their job. And then you see people still trying to then give their job to AI. It's the other extreme of that. And it's interesting, kind of one of the phrases I like to use is it's just a tool in the toolbox, and making sure the users understand it's just like a wrench in your toolbox. You still have to be in control. So you know if it's righty-tighty or lefty-loosey. So you still have to control that tool. And once they kind of start thinking it like a hammer or a wrench and using it in the right place for the right role, a lot better adoption happens. So that's all. So as we really start talking about, we kind of mentioned some pricing, and one of the other conversations I saw in here was pricing about AI and Copilot and specifically in particular. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to head this back over to Edwin to kind of discuss what this kind of means.
Great. Thank you, Heath. So now that we're back, let's connect all of this behavior into another pressure organizations are dealing with and has also been called out in the chat a few moments ago, which is cost. So we already know from the research that 48% of employees are using unapproved AI tools. At the same time, Microsoft 365 pricing changes have already taken effect as of July of this year. So that creates a very real governance decision for organizations as businesses look at licensing costs and decide who should or should not have access to AI capabilities. There can be a very real temptation to solve the budget problem simply by just restricting access. However, if the underlying demand for AI is already there, removing the sanction option doesn't necessarily remove the behavior. It can simply just move the behavior somewhere else. It can move the behavior into personal accounts, consumer AI tools, or other environments that are not so easily governed or monitored. So there's a window right now, what we're seeing, to make deliberate governance decisions instead of letting cost pressures make those decisions for you or by default. If it's one thing that I want to hit home here is that the cheapest time to govern AI is before cost forces organizations into a decision that creates an even bigger visibility problem. Now we'll dive in, or we'll dig into the drivers on that in the next slide here. Now all of the information culminates to this slide here, and this is exactly the cycle that we are coaching organizations to avoid. The first is demand does not disappear. If employees have discovered that AI helps them research or summarize, analyze, write, or automate work, removing an AI license doesn't suddenly remove those use cases. Second, the options narrow. If employees lose access to the sanctioned tooling, some will find another tool that gives them the capabilities that they're looking for. And third, the pattern repeats. Every time we impose a restriction without giving employees a viable or viably approved alternative, we recreate the conditions that produced shadow AI in the first place. Now, it's this cycle is why licensing strategy and governance strategy really need to be discussed in parallel or in tandem. Saving money on access can look attractive on a sheet, but it becomes much less attractive if it results in employees moving sensitive work into environments where you have no visibility or less control. So before we transition into the next section, the objective should not be unrestricted AI access, and it shouldn't be blanket restrictions either. The objective is a governed path, one that balances access with security, compliance, and adoption. And Daniel's going to walk us through, as well as Heath, what that path can look like in just a moment.
So when we talk about building that governed pathway adoption, what's that mean? In fact, there was one of the questions in the Q&A that asked, what do we do when senior leadership doesn't see the problem with using a particular AI tool? All we can do is inform and educate, let them know based on data and evidence what the impact of that tool is. Because even, like they could want Copilot, let's say, but we all know Copilot free, Copilot paid, there are different outcomes and different risks to the organization. If people are using a public Copilot, logging in with their personal Copilot accounts, that has a different risk to the organization than if it's organization driven. There are ways that you can control Claude and or ChatGPT and or insert AI tool here that make it a safer option for the company. So all we can do is inform them on potential risks, and they're the senior leaders. They still get to make the decision. And so we take it from there, but we do our due diligence. And obviously one of the questions that another attendee responded back with is, we can talk about the EU AI Act and the penalties that can be personally applied to directors. So there are laws in different areas that can arm that. I didn't know where the original question was coming from regionally, so I can't answer some of those, but it's all about informing. So if the leader still chooses to go with the unapproved route now, or the undesired route, now it's how do we at least get it governed? How do we create a governed path to adopting that tool as much as possible? And to talk about building that governed path, I'm going to hand it back off to Daniel.
Thank you, Heath. Yes. So for that question here, this kind of slide here is going to kind of answer that a bit more in depth here. So I'm going to go quickly over the framework here. So this framework is a simple way to think about the governed AI adoption. First, assess what is already happening, including where shadow AI may exist. Second, govern the environment with the right security, compliance, permissions, and data protection controls. And so, for instance, if in that situation where like leadership is approving, let's say, the unauthorized use of ChatGPT because maybe it's cheaper, maybe it's just better overall for the environment, and you want to make sure that you have at least the security controls in place to protect against malicious AI usage, and you guys are making sure that you guys are following in compliance with whatever regulations or laws that kind of are applied to your organization. Because otherwise, you might fall into that issue where you guys might be in violation of maybe a compliance or a law in that case. And so making sure that you guys have the right kind of security controls in place to kind of help make sure that if you guys do kind of break around and kind of have that kind of AI app that's not really approved, then at least having those guardrails in place to kind of make sure that you're limiting the amount of exposure or risk that is involved. Jumping into the third item here, which is enablement. Enable employees with the approved path and training to workflows. And so just making sure that you guys at least have that pipeline to train people to at least use the approved applications or AI applications will kind of lead you down the right path. And the fourth item here, which is the skill by monitoring adoption and expanding into higher value use cases over time. And so that order is important. If we skip the assessment, we may miss oversharing, unmanaged apps, or sensitive data patterns. So, and you can use tools like Microsoft Purview, like DLP, for instance, like one of the people in the chat here kind of mentions here, or Defender for Cloud Apps that can help kind of surface those risks or kind of suppress it. And so, but the bigger point is that governance has to come before broader enablement. If we govern without giving users a useful alternative, they may keep working around the process. And if we enable it without monitoring, it becomes hard to know whether Copilot's producing value or just sitting there as another license tool. And so this is not about choosing between governance and adoption. It is about understanding the risk and putting those guardrails in place, giving people a usable path, and then scaling visibility. And so governance is not about just slowing AI down. It is about creating a safe path to adopt and scale with visibility. And on the next slide here, we'll connect that framework to our specialization in Copilot and kind of explain our specialization there. And so this is where kind of Trusted Tech comes into play. We help customers move from wanting to use Copilot to deliver it in a secure and practical way with readiness, deployment, and training, governance, and business-focused adoption planning. The first proof point is customer adoption. So for an example, I work with the customer to explore ways to drive adoption, including targeted trainings and leadership engagement. And we helped move their Copilot adoption rating from the low 80 percentile range to that mid 90 percentile range just by going over plans and discussions on how they can kind of push that adoption in their environment into the kind of the mid 90s. The second point here is we have deep expertise. Trusted Tech is full of Microsoft certified professionals across Microsoft 365 administration, security compliance, Copilot Studio, and that gives you all the depth needed, the knowledge that we have the depth needed to deploy Copilot securely and correctly. And it also includes real-world Copilot delivery and agentic capabilities, meaning validated customer engagements and experience building custom agents with Copilot Studio to support repeatable business processes. And the last point is Microsoft's recognized excellence. This connects the Copilot specialization to Trusted Tech's broader Microsoft Solutions partner destinations across modern work, security, Azure, data and AI, and business applications. The takeaway is that this is not one narrow capability. It reflects a broader ability to help customers plan, secure, adopt, and extend Copilot in a practical way. This specialization matters because Copilot products usually touch more than one area: identity, data permission, security, adoptions, and sometimes automation. And that is the real value behind our organization. It affects the ability to help customers get ready, deploy securely, drive adoption, and expand to higher value use cases over time. And so this specialization here kind of shows Trusted Tech can help customers adopt Copilot securely and turn it into real business value. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Heath to go over the readiness assessments.
Yeah, before we go to the next slide, one thing I want to add in, although this is talking about a Copilot specialization, I mean, we are a Microsoft partner. We do have every solution designation for Microsoft, and this is a specialization. But the concepts that I want to focus on here, enabling customer adoption, we can also enable that whether it is Claude Enterprise or ChatGPT. But why we included this slide here specific to Copilot is because this is not just us telling you what we can do. This is actually Microsoft telling you that we can do it as well. And for Microsoft to say that, they had to have customers tell them that it's something we can do. So all of these things, like I said, because it's talking about Copilot, that's a designation. But we have expertise across the AI stack. This webinar is on Shadow AI. We haven't been talking about specific product sets. So I see there's a lot of Claude Enterprise. I myself have used Claude Enterprise, and I'm not going to sit here and talk badly about any other AI. There are things that different tools do better. You know, when I talk about my wrench analogy, sometimes you need a metric, sometimes you need a standard size wrench. You know, are we talking 12 millimeters or are we talking a half inch? And so those kind of things are kind of key to keep in mind. But now as we move to the next slide, one of the questions came up with, are we going to talk about DLP and readiness? I mentioned we have a readiness assessment. And so our AI readiness assessment does take a look at your environment. It does leverage our expertise plus the knowledge of your environment to make recommendations of what you can do. Daniel mentioned Purview. I know there was a comment in the chat about DLP. So we'll talk about during this assessment, how can you maybe leverage Purview's capabilities around automatic classification of data and tagging, because then that gives you something that you can pivot your AI to avoid. What I always say when it comes to AI, most data leakage in an organization isn't malicious. It's, you know, an employee in HR just needed to share something really quickly with a manager. So they put it somewhere that they knew was easy for the manager to access and forgot to remove it. It wasn't malicious. Was it wrong? Did it violate policies? Yes. But did they want to hurt anybody? No. But what happens is someone with malicious intent gets access to your network and then can use AI to maximize the damage they can create from that non-malicious intent very quickly. And so one of the things our assessment does is kind of takes a look at the way you're using your AI, your current security posture. Do you have DLP in place? Free advice. This isn't about an assessment at this point. If you're going to do a wide scale rollout of AI, please make sure you have DLP in place. It protects you from that non-malicious intent causing malicious harm. Making sure that you have your adoption roadmap in place. And I mentioned also one thing our specialization gives us is the ability to get funding from Microsoft when possible. I love nothing more than to go get funding from Microsoft, because the more Microsoft pays, the less budget you have to worry about spending on it. That gives you something else cool that we can work on. I'll tell you the typical cost of our AI readiness assessment is $7,500. But for anybody in attendance today, because we really just love what this assessment does, we love what this assessment does for you, and we'd be happy to meet more and discuss. We're discounted for $3,000. And as an added bonus, that $3,000 you spend on the assessment is actually credited. Let's say we talk about assessing your AI usage, and then we talk about building an adoption roadmap, and you say, hey, I'd really like TrustedTech to come in and deliver the end user training and awareness and readiness around this. I'm going to credit that $3,000 towards the cost of that training. So you actually get that $3,000 twice. And for any of you that are already on a support plan with us, there's a strong possibility you have that available in your ProServe credit allowance. So you can get this assessment at no cost. So it's all very, very interesting to kind of see what we can do. We'd love to have these conversations. To have a conversation with us costs you nothing. And if we go on to the next slide. So we talk about AI adoption and that readiness assessment. Our goal is to really help you unlock productivity gains, strengthen your security. I want AI's coming. And I go back to my vacuum statement. If we don't give our end users a solution, they're going to find one on their own. And then they're going to go to public Gemini or ChatGPT or even Copilot chat that's public. And they're going to start uploading company documents and saying, can you clean this up for me? And now you've lost control of your intellectual property and your confidential company data. Please give them a solution. Doesn't have to be Copilot. What solution works for you? We're happy to have that conversation, and let's make sure they're adopting it safely and securely. So as we move to the next slide, this is simply if you'd like to at least have a conversation with us about that AI readiness assessment, you can click that link right there. Someone's going to reach out to you within a day. The worst thing that could happen is you're like, not for me, and say no. But hopefully we can go into some more and learn that, not trying to make this a sales pitch. So hopefully you understand the risks. And while you guys are getting through that, let's go ahead and start dealing with some of the other chat comments. And what use is a Copilot Plus laptop or other AI-enabled laptops with general use? All AI processing goes to the cloud provider interface, and nothing is leveraging the local AI capabilities. I don't know what you think of the AI-powered laptops. I think it's a great marketing buzzword myself. What do you think of them, Daniel? I won't put you on the spot. You can say, sorry, my microphone's not working if you want.
No. I actually had a former coworker of ours actually have one of those, I think they were HP Copilot laptops. They're really, really strong, mainly because the processor has a bit of an built-in function to kind of help support the Copilot functionality in there. And so overall, the results have been pretty strong when they used Copilot within that laptop. I personally haven't really delved much into it personally on my end, so I don't really have real experiences on whether or not there's a bit of a big difference between a non-Copilot powered laptop and a regular laptop. But I'm assuming the results would be that you would get kind of quick responses if it kind of has any kind of local handling of the data. But um, I think. I think for the most part, when it comes to like cloud AI versus local AI, and I kind of mentioned it in the chat here, you pretty much have there. It's almost like the same when it comes to like local, like your Active Directory, hosting it on the cloud and hosting it on like a local AI kind of, or not AI, like a local server, for instance. If you host it locally, if there's a local instance of it, you'll get not only lower latency with the AI responses, but also a little bit more security in terms of the data being hosted locally as opposed to being hosted on the cloud. And that's always been an issue that kind of comes up when it comes to the fight between whether or not to have your servers be hosted all as cloud or being all locally or just to go with a hybrid approach. It's almost the same kind of conversation there.
So much of it is such a nuanced case. If we're talking about a crawl, walk, run, though, of Copilot or AI in general adoption in an organization, I think there's a level of let's get end users using AI safely, securely, and efficiently before we worry about whether or not their laptop's the bottleneck.
Mhm.
I'm put that as eloquently as I can. So I did see a question I want to bring up from the Q&A. I know, Daniel, you've already answered this one, but do you recommend or know of any companies creating their own agents within AI, using things like company constitutions, handbooks, policies, rules, and regulations? How helpful and successful could that be in preventing shadow AI? And I know you'd already answered this one, Daniel, but I don't know if you wanted to answer it for the broader audience to kind of hear.
Yes. So in the past, we've handled consulting sessions regarding Copilot Studio, especially when it comes to people who want to build agents inside of the not only the paid Copilot Studio kind of platform, but also the agents inside of your included Microsoft 365 licensing. In most of the cases, a lot of people have had positive feedback, mainly because when we go through the setup here, we kind of drove down the actual idea that when it comes to setting up these agents, you really need to make sure that you are setting up the system prompts. So what those instructions are for that agent and the knowledge base correctly, because what's going to happen is that when the agent ends up kind of going through its thinking, when you send over a prompt that let's say, hey, let's say for instance, I ask an agent like, what is this company known for? Do you have the correct system prompt to be able to handle that information from that prompt in a way that delivers an output that aligns with whatever the agent's designed for is? And do you have the knowledge sources that provides that accurate information? Are you pointing it correctly to, let's say, SharePoint that has, let's say, all of your company files? Do you have it, let's say, pointed to your website, for instance, that it has like an about you page, for instance? Does it have the knowledge to be able to pull that information accurately to be able to generate you an actual useful response? And so it's making sure that those two items are fulfilled in the agent itself, that you get an actual agent that's actually useful. And so once we have those two kind of main points knocked out in those consulting sessions, a lot of customers have had positive reactions or positive opinions so far on the agent. Most of the issues just come boiled down to really just deployment and billing utilization, because if you start to go jump into Copilot Studio and the whole pricing structure once you deploy to, let's say, a web or any other service that's outside of Microsoft, you start to really kind of look into the billing aspect of it, and that's when the whole conversation gets a bit muddy.
But it is important. You bring up a good point there, Daniel. The source data, simply giving access to data is not good enough, because
Yes.
AI, one of the things I like, AI, everybody thinks it's so smart. It's really not. It only knows how to do what you tell it to. So if you say, go find me this data, it will find you that data. It can't really gauge. It is probably not, at that point, if you're pointing at your entire internal systems, accuracy. So it is important to make sure your prompts are written in a way, because you can make it do more gauging of the accuracy or recency or all those things. But if you don't tell it that, or you don't build agents that are really injecting that, then you end up with bad output. So another question we have in the Q&A panel, many of the use cases being labeled as AI are really data integration and automation challenges, such as moving data between systems, synchronizing platforms, or centralizing information in a data lake. Do you provide guidance or best practices for data federation, systems integration, and data lake architecture to support these types of initiatives? The short answer is yes. We do have those kind of conversations, and that's where we go beyond, right? When we talk about the data sources, actually, that I was just referencing, that kind of is where that comes into play. I do think AI, it can be a little overused as a term. A lot of what AI is what machine learning was, 10 years ago. Or the automation of moving data, right? When you look at the capabilities of automatically moving data across data tiers, right? Just a simple use case like that. Is that really AI? No, that's just simply, hey, based on these rules being in place, we're going to transfer data across storage tiers to optimize costs. Or we're going to introduce them or inject them into this data lake or data warehouse based on these rules. That's not AI. AI is where you really start doing stuff with that data at that point. If anybody has anything to add, feel free. I've been in the Q&A panel. I think we're caught up on the Q&A panel. Oh.
And then I will mention, if you guys are struggling with any of the responses from Copilot, there is an option to change it from ChatGPT to Claude, or to like a better version of the actual agent itself. And so if you guys are, let's say, working with Copilot and you guys are getting kind of just subpar responses, don't be afraid to click into that auto tab at the top and switch that agent to, let's say, be Claude Sonnet or Claude Opus, or maybe ChatGPT, maybe think deeper. Because sometimes what it might do is it might automate to the just get a response quickly portion, and sometimes that might just get you a response that's a bit subpar. So if you guys are kind of dealing with frustrations with AI and kind of wanting to, have maybe kind of a second look into Copilot again, maybe just switch up the agent so that way it's maybe going to a stronger agent. Might get your response that's a bit slower, but at least it's something that's going to give you at least some kind of value out of it, as opposed to just sending over 3 to 4 prompts that still get you nowhere.
And what you'll probably start finding, you'll gravitate, because you'll find that changing that will actually, you'll start aligning that to your specific use cases, and you'll learn, oh, when I'm doing this, I want to be on the ChatGPT. When I'm doing this, I want to shift to Claude. When I'm doing this. And so you'll find what works out best for you for each of those cases. Any other questions, comments? Any answers? Oh, yes. Keeping users from vibe coding their full automation. Yes. But it's once again, it still goes back to the vacuum. If we haven't given them a better solution, they are going to find a way. And that's why the governance becomes so important.
There's a question here in the chat that I want to mention here, which is there plans to be more like additional per user billing for the Copilot cowork? As far as I'm aware, the way how the payment structure for cowork is going to be it's going to be through credits moving forward. There is a prepaid option for the P3 credit pack, if I recall correctly, which I think we offer. I have to double check internally, but there's a prepaid option for the credits if you guys do want to go down that route. But in terms of the traditional per user billing, you can limit the Copilot cowork option to only be for specific users. And so if you want to, let's say, limit down that feature to only be, let's say, a group of 2 to 3 developers, for instance, you can limit that to those 2 to 3 users.
Good stuff. I know we have 4 minutes left. Oh, we got another question in just when I thought. Do any tools show actual credit usage for user billing? Seeing everything is only balanced with billing managers. Users need to use their token usage, and I haven't figured that out yet.
The best thing I know of, if we're talking about just regular Copilot, not cowork, is there is a report under reports, and I think there is a Copilot section on there that at least gives you knowledge in the amount of responses or the engagement that a user has with Copilot. Now, in terms of the other AI tools out there, I think Claude has their own usage reporting on the user side, but I think Keith, I don't know if you have any information on that.
Yep. Claude will do it user-based. I know that. I bet I could ask our IT team, because I know as we try and work with all different AI tools, I always find out when people on my team by individual are spending too much. And so I know that they have a way to report across multiple tools, because we do use lots of options here because we want to make sure we're able to support our customers. So we have access to just about every AI tool imaginable, and they know it by user how much they're spending, because I have to approve it every time. Speaking of vibe coding, I had one user that racked up quite the bill very quickly in the month. I love the idea of the AI champion team, because you're really doing that core kind of that V team, and by building champions when it comes to adoption. One company I worked for many moons ago did a lot of technology marketing, and we had great success in adoption campaigns. And that's because we ran technology adoption like it was a marketing campaign. And I've carried that forward through my different technology companies since, that are more focused on traditional integration type style work. And it's that same kind of concepts, though. The idea of building your champions, because those are the people that go back to the water cooler. They're the ones that shift the mentality and mindset from, oh God, what's IT doing to us now, to, man, when am I going to get that? I know Joe's already had it. And so they completely shift the mindset around technology change and adoption. And having those champions where you're hearing from everybody, and it's a level of consensus building, greatly increases adoption. I do know we are at time now, and I want to be cognizant of everybody's day. Obviously, I believe we do send out or make the recording available. If we haven't sent it to you early on enough, talk to your account team. If you don't have it within a few days, and we'll make sure we get it to you. Hopefully we'll see y'all on our next webinar, and we'll continue to move along. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your time. You have a great day.